Well, I'm delighted today to be joined by Stephen Law. Stephen is a director of the Certificate in Higher Education and director of philosophy at the Department of Continuing Education at the University of Oxford. And he's the author of many books and journal articles. What I most appreciate about Stephen is his commitment to taking philosophy out of the graduate seminar and bringing it into public life. So he edits the philosophy journal Think, Philosophy for Everyone, and has written several books for a general readership, including The Philosophy Gym, Believing Bullshit, and What Am I Doing with My Life, and Other Late Night Internet Searches Answered by the Great Philosophers, which is a great subtitle. And it's also important to know that Stephen is not a nerd. Many academics are nerds, but Stephen plays drums in a band. He climbs mountains and does a lot of other cool stuff. So Stephen, thank you for joining us. I'm delighted to have you with us. And I'd like to begin by pitching this question to you before we kind of get into it. And the question is, if you could go back in time and see any deceased artist, someone currently deceased, musical artist perform, who would it be?
Gosh, that's tricky. Possibly Jimi Hendrix. Maybe Johann Sebastian Bach or Beethoven. One of those would be great. Yeah, I don't know.
Anywhere from Bach to Hendrix, that's a good one. That's shows you have a very diverse musical tastes.
Yeah, maybe if we could get them on at the same time, that could be really interesting.
Maybe in the Righteous Brothers Rock and Roll Heaven, they're playing right now. Who knows?
Yeah.
Although I take it you probably are a little skeptical about that, about heaven. So my next question I just had as we kind of move in. Now we're going to be discussing the problem of evil and Stephen's evil God argument momentarily, but I was just thinking about this on the drive into my office this morning, and so I wanted to pitch it to you. So if you have three options going forward right now, and the one option is just to keep living your life as it is. Option two would be to shift by going into a matrix, like in the movie The Matrix. But you input all the information at the beginning before you enter into the matrix for how your life will go. So for example, okay, I'm going to ensure from now on I'm going to have a great job, happy fulfilling marriage, long life, fantastic friends, drink lots of tasty beer, have great concerts and so on, and die at a ripe old age of 90 with no physical ailments. And then you go into that matrix world, and from that point on, you're unaware that you're in a matrix world, but you've guaranteed things are going to be great. Versus option three, you go into a matrix and you're aware of it, and every day you can input how your life is going to go for the next day. And so on both of those options, you're really the only mind in there, right? And you're in a matrix interacting with all this sensory data, but there's no one else. Do you find any lure in the second or third options, or would you just stay with life as it is? What do you think?
Well, the concern, I suppose, about the matrix type environment is that it's not real, and the achievements and the relationships that you forge are not with real people. There's just the illusion of your having made a personal connection with someone. You never actually make a personal connection with somebody. There's the illusion that you've climbed Mount Everest, but you haven't actually climbed it, and your life was never actually in any real danger, and it was a foregone conclusion that you were going to reach the top and so on. So yeah, the lack of authentic achievements and relationships is a bit of a concern. So for that reason, I'm probably going to say no, although it's very tempting. Okay. The guy in the Matrix actually chooses that, doesn't he? He wants to be able to eat steak again, and he just wants to be able to forget and go back to where it was.
Yeah, it's kind of the red or blue pill kind of question.
Yeah.
I share your intuitions with that, but I do wish sometimes I could control my days. That's for sure. Last random question before we get into it, but I went into the bathroom or washroom or WC at work here, and I noticed that there's been a spider that was in the urinal for a while, kind of living in the urinal. And this morning I saw that the spider is dead. and it reminded me of this passage in The View from Nowhere by Thomas Nagel, where he talked about every day he'd walk into the washroom and seeing the urinal spider in the urinal, and he felt sorry for it. So one day he fished it out, and the next day he saw it had not moved from where he had put it the day before, and it had just died. And it was a very sort of existential kind of scenario. And so that but rather bizarre starting point, I'd simply ask this question from your perspective as a philosopher, someone who's very interested in public philosophy, thinks a lot about big questions. What is a meaningful life?
Yeah, it's a very difficult question to answer. I think that one way in which you can lead a meaningful life is probably to have a worthwhile project. I mean, genuinely worthwhile, and not just under the illusion that it's worthwhile. A worthwhile project that you commit to and pursue with some passion. And I think that even if you don't succeed, you can have a worthwhile existence in pursuing it. So, you know, Scott of the Antarctic, he didn't make it to the pole first, but still, that was an amazing life that he led. It was a worthwhile project that he pursued with passion and so on. So that, I guess, that's one way in which you could do it. It's always a bit tricky, these kind of questions where people ask, you know, what is the thing that's required? What is the necessary and sufficient condition for somebody to lead a meaningful life? And it may be that there is no one recipe or one thing. You know, maybe it's a family resemblance concept. Wittgenstein talks about family resemblance concepts. There could be the members of a family. If you look at them, some have the bushy eyebrows and some have the big nose and some have the funny shaped ears and so on, but there's no one thing they all have in common, and yet they kind of hang together. You can see that they somehow belong together. And so similarly, he thought that the concept game was like that. You know, there are board games, card games, competitive games, games you play on your own and so on. What is it that all games have in common? He thought there probably wasn't anything. And so, you know, some other concepts may well be like that too, and it may be the idea of, you know, a meaningful existence. What is a meaningful existence? Well, maybe there are many different ways in which you could have a meaningful existence. Maybe there isn't one thing. The search for the one thing that makes all existences meaningful may be a wild goose chase, a bit like trying to search for the one thing that all games have in common. Maybe there just isn't anything.
Well, you said the one thing I just want to hone in on a little bit is genuine, having a genuine or a project that's genuinely valuable or something to that effect, you said.
Yeah.
I some years ago, I saw a documentary called The King of Kong, and it was about a guy who set out to master the 1980s video game King or Donkey Kong. And so he became the King of Kong. And that was a project that infused his life with a fair amount of satisfaction in that. Does that count as a genuinely valuable project? Or in your mind, how would one discern that?
Good. Well, that's a really hard thing. Again, very hard question. So it had better not involve you know, causing suffering to other people. For example, if I decide to spend my life kicking people in the shins at every available opportunity and I pursue that with vigor and passion, I don't think I'm leading a meaningful existence. So it had better not do that. As to what guarantees that you know, it's a worthwhile project, it's hard to say. There are probably many different ways in which things can be worthwhile. Yeah, I'm struggling to come up with some I mean, you know, is it worthwhile going to, you know, the South Pole? I mean, how is that benefiting anyone? It's not really. It's an entirely on the face of it, you might think, quite a sort of narcissistic project. I just want to be first. I just want to, and yet we still consider it to be worthwhile. So I don't think we need to set the bar too high.
Or for mountains, was it Hillary's famous comment, you climb the mountain because it's there? Or you call it
Yeah,
the South Pole
yeah.
because it's there?
So as to what makes it worthwhile, it's a very difficult question to answer, but clearly some things are not.
Yeah. Okay.
A project that just involved inflicting suffering on other people is not a worthwhile project.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't.
So King of Kong may be okay, but King of Shin kicking, not okay.
Yeah, that's as much as you're going to get from me, I think.
All right. Well, that's a decent segue to the problem of evil, because
Mhm,
of course, central to the problem of evil is the question of suffering in the world. So, what is
mhm.
the problem of evil for a theist, as you see it?
Well, so by evil, the theist typically means two things. So there's moral evil, morally bad things that we do. We cause wars, and we steal, and we do other morally depraved things. So there's that kind of evil. And then there's also natural evil, as it's known. So natural diseases and disasters cause great suffering. And there are then two problems of evil. There's the logical one, as it's known, which says that if there exists any evil at all, then there is no God. That logically entails there's no God, because God being all powerful can prevent evil, and God being all knowing will know about any evil, and God being all good will not want there to be any evil. So if there's any evil at all, even a teaspoonful, it logically follows that there's no God. That's the argument. That's widely considered not to be a terribly good argument, because God may actually allow evils if there is some very good reason for allowing them. If there's some very great good that more than compensates for the evil, then God may allow the evil in order to obtain that greater good. So, arguably something like free will, or having the ability to choose freely, is a very great good, and it allows for important goods. And if you take that away from us, well, the world is missing something terrifically valuable and important. But the downside is that if you allow us free will, some of us will choose to cause evil. That's the price you unavoidably have to pay. So it seems that the logical problem is not really much of a problem. The problem that is widely considered to be a pretty serious problem, on the other hand, is the evidential problem of evil. And you can set that up in different ways. And my preferred way of setting it up is just to run it in exactly the same way as the logical problem, but you just add a word. And the word is gratuitous. You stick the word gratuitous in front of evil. And a gratuitous evil is an evil for which there is no adequate God justifying reason. God may allow evils if there is a good reason to allow them, but he's not going to allow them otherwise. He's not going to allow gratuitous evils. So if there's any gratuitous evil, even a teaspoonful, it follows that there's no God. And now, looking around, you might think, well, there's not just evil. There is surely a great deal of gratuitous evil. There's an awful lot of pain and suffering that appears to be entirely pointless from, a divine perspective. So things like childhood mortality rates for the 300, well, I think the current best estimate of the species Homo sapiens being on this planet is around 350,000 years, and for almost that entire period, your chances of making it to adulthood were not much better than 50-50. So countless generations of human children have died, usually pretty horribly, painfully. Their parents will have had to watch them die horribly and painfully. They wouldn't have been able to do anything about it. Ask any parent that's lost a child what's the worst thing they've experienced, and they'll probably say that is psychological torment, and quite almost unimaginable, really. There is an awful lot of pain and suffering, and it's very difficult to see what divine purpose there could be to all of that. And there needs to be a good reason for not just a bit of it, but every last ounce. If there's any gratuitous pain and suffering, there is no God. It's very difficult to see, for us to see, how there could be a good reason for every last ounce of it. And so at that point, then it looks like the fact that we're presented with what appears to be a great deal of gratuitous evil provides us with very powerful we have very powerful evidence there against the existence of God. So that's the problem as it's standardly presented nowadays. Does that sound right to you?
Yeah, yeah, that's a very good synopsis. And I would just probably want to add, I think sometimes what gets missed in the discussion is the emotive weight, the emotional weight that comes with specific instances of suffering. So, for example, when Roe talks about the deer that was burned in the forest, that
Yeah.
it's one thing to talk about evil or suffering in the abstract, but the argument you just presented gets a lot more weight when you give thick narrative descriptions of actual instances of suffering. Uh,
Yeah.
so I just
That's a
want to cycle back. Sorry, but I just want to
that's
cycle
a
back to a couple of things.
oh, sure.
So the first one, before we leave the logical problem behind,
Mm,
so you talked about this one possible response there. Well, God could want to create free creatures.
mm.
Here's my problem with that kind of argument. It seems perfectly possible to make free creatures who only choose good. I mean, if you make them with a particular moral nature and a particular level of knowledge about the world and what are the kind of actions that are flourishing, then to choose evil would be akin to choosing to eat feces rather than like a chocolate pudding for dessert. Right? You just wouldn't eat feces unless you're a dog or some dogs.
Mm.
But you'd always choose the chocolate pudding for dessert because you're a rational, intelligent person.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, why wouldn't God just create and populate a world with the kinds of creatures that would not need to or be inclined to do evil actions in order and still have free will? Does that make sense?
Yeah. No, that's a very interesting point. Why not? Why not give us good natures, and then as a consequence of our having those good natures, we will freely choose to do good rather than evil and so on. Yeah, I suppose that, I mean, I'm not a theist, but they may respond in a variety of ways to that. They may say, well, if you really do have a good nature that prevents you from doing anything other than choosing the good, then you're not really a free agent at all. That's just the illusion of freedom. Some people say, well, look, God needs to recede back and be in the shadows somewhat, because if it's too clear that he exists and that this is what's good and that's, then we are not going to be able to choose freely because we're effectively going to be compelled by the fact that it's staring us in the face. His presence is staring us in the face. So there are various strategies that they might adopt. But yeah, on the face of it, why not just make us good? Does it, I think Tim Morton, I mean, this, if it follows, of course, that if God is by nature incapable of doing evil, then God lacks free will.
Mm-hmm.
But that's a bullet that some will bite. They will say, well, he lacks the kind of free will that we have, but there's a different kind of free will that God has. Then maybe that's the kind of free will that but then the reply would be, well, that's the kind of free will he could have given us, the kind that
Yeah,
he's got, which is probably presumably even better than the
yeah.
kind that we. So yeah, so it's a good question. That's a can of worms you've opened there.
Mm.
Yeah.
I mean, and of course, it would also apply if a theist buys into the bigger story of posthumous existence in something like heaven, quote unquote, where there is no more suffering, pain, and so on.
Yeah.
Then we will, in that sense, surrender the kind of free will that makes evil suffering possible now. So why not just get rid of this whole
Yeah.
chapter?
I seem to remember that Tim Morton says that, well, that's why there are, free will on our having the ability to choose freely. That's an important good. So we have that now, and then later on we will lack it when we're in heaven, so we don't screw things up there. And so there's a very good situation there too. And so we're getting the best of all possible worlds in this particular combination.
Mm.
We have free will here, we lack it there. But then there's pain and suffering here. There won't be pain and suffering later on. And whatever pain and suffering we experience in this life can be more than adequately compensated for in the next. So I think he thinks it somehow all makes sense. Not sure I agree, but
Do you think let me give a contrast between two persons. So let's say Joe and Dave. Joe doesn't have any violent tendencies, and he goes through life, or let's say that he doesn't have any violent tendencies, and he goes with Dave to the bar, and there's some obnoxious guy that's speaking off, and Joe's just chill the whole time, and he just drinks his Guinness. Dave has tendencies to burst out in rage when someone obnoxious is speaking off. And so when he goes with Joe to the bar and he's drinking his Guinness and this guy starts beaking off at them, what he does is he intentionally controls those impulses within him. And when they both leave, nobody's the wiser, but neither one responded to this obnoxious guy. But Dave has exhibited a virtue of self-control that Joe never needed to exercise because he doesn't have that inclination to violence. And could there be intrinsic value in Dave's having controlled himself in that circumstance? And could God value that? And so maybe something like those kinds of second order goods of self-control are part of the story. Does that make sense possible?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. Yeah.
All right, let's turn back then to the gratuitous evil. So you said, so gratuitous evil is evil that doesn't have a point. Well, the first thing I'm wondering, is it possible that there could be a point in making a universe with evils that have no point?
Gosh, what an abstract question.
It's kind of like, is there value in a game of chance, right? In setting up a game where there's chance, so that, like roulette, right? Could there be value in having the game where it's not all about skill, there's some degree of chance, where there's not, where there's some degree of gratuitous evil? Could the existence of those kinds of evils as a set have value, even if the specific evils are gratuitous?
Yeah, it's hard to, I'm struggling to see how there could be, to be honest. Yeah, I mean, so you're thinking about a situation like, so it would be nice to have like a concrete example, a concrete illustration or example. So you're thinking about, I don't know, we set up a situation where we have a lovely a nursery full of children, and there's a device here that will fire hot coals into the nursery. And obviously there will be a lot of evil if you do that. Now, why would there be a good reason to have this thing set up so that randomly it will decide whether or not to do? In what way is that a good situation? I can't see it, but that seems to be what you're envisaging.
I guess so. What I'm thinking is like well, one way to think about it is some people have a reaction, like if God is meticulously provident, so he's provident in all circumstances such that there are no gratuitous evils. Some people kind of react negatively to that scenario, kind of like, well, the world lacks a certain intrinsic goodness if God is just there controlling every detail. So to have randomness written into the structure of nature to some degree has intrinsic value. And if the randomness, a byproduct of it, is that you'll have a certain amount of gratuitous evil that is produced, then they would still say, but the intrinsic randomness of this kind of world is preferable to a world in which God is meticulously provident.
Yeah, I don't understand why the randomness, the fact that I've, got a little a little random generator here that's going to, it's 50-50 whether it's going to tip the hot coals into the nursery or not. I don't understand why, in what way is that good? I mean, I can see why you might think that a universe that's set up in such a way that nothing other than what's going to happen is going to happen, that it's all somehow predetermined by God, that somehow that's lacking important goods. But I don't see that sticking a randomness generator in there really makes anything better. The thing that's supposed to make it better is to introduce free will, which is not randomness at all, but supposedly something else. You introduce free agents, and now you can't predict what's going to happen. Now what they do isn't determined, but not because you've introduced randomness, but because you've introduced free will, which is supposed to be a very great good. But I can see no intrinsic value in just introducing randomness.
Okay.
It's like, yeah, not yet anyway.
Well, let me try another tack. So just I think I agree with you on the face of it. You just look out at the world, it looks like there's gratuitous evil out there. I always remember it was December 26, 2004. I was in a shopping mall and I began hearing the reports about this earthquake in, I think, just off of Sumatra, right, which ended up sweeping more than 230,000 individual human beings into the ocean, drowning them, and
Hmm.
untold animals, wreaking all sorts of carnage. So let's say 231,978 people drowned. X number were missing for a while, and their family members were traumatized, simply not knowing what their fate was. Many more were injured, and so on. Then to claim all of all of that suffering was meticulously designed, God had a reason for every bit of it. It seems implausible, you could say, and it certainly seems that that earthquake is a clear example of gratuitous evil. But another person might come back and say, but if you begin with the assumption that there is a God who is
Hmm.
meticulously provident, then you will be inclined to say, as a result of my belief in meticulous providence, there just is no gratuitous evil. So is it possible that two people with different starting assumptions as to the existence or non-existence of a meticulously provident God might come away thinking there is or is not gratuitous evil, and thus the problem of evil is a problem for one but not the other?
Um, well, I'm not sure if the problem disappears for one of them, but there's still a problem there. But yeah, if they think that the case for a provident God is absolutely overwhelming, setting aside gratuitous evil, then the fact that there appears to be gratuitous evil, they may say, okay, well, there appears to be gratuitous evil, but perhaps, you know, there is a very good reason for it. They could be skeptical theists at this point. They could say, for all I know, there's a good reason back there. Just because I can't think of it doesn't mean it's not there. Um, and seeing as I have a very good, excellent reason to think that there is a provident God that would never allow evil pointlessly, well, then, it's perfectly reasonable for me to suppose that whilst you might think that this is gratuitous evil, I really don't see that it is, even if I can't myself explain it. They could take that view potentially, if they had a really, really good reason to think that there was a provident God of that sort. Yeah. But boy, it's going to have to be pretty good, isn't it?
Hmm. Now you mentioned there in passing, and I think a couple times, about whether we could know or what God's reasons were. So this kind of brings us into the territory of skeptical theism. So
Yeah.
maybe could you briefly define what skeptical theism is and whether you think that offers the theist a satisfactory response to the problem?
Yeah, sure. So, um, one way in which people have traditionally responded to the problem of evil is to provide the actual explanations or justifications for the evils, and those are known as theodicies. So you can try and explain some of the evil by saying, well, it's a result of our being given free will. God gave us free will. Some of us choose to do evil. That's unfortunate. Or you could try and explain the evil by suggesting that it's there for character building purposes. The child that's riding her bike and falls off and grazes her knee. There's pain and suffering, but the parent encourages the child to get back on the bike, knowing full well that there will be more pain and suffering. Why does the parent do that? Because the parent knows that at the end of the day, the child will learn to ride the bike and will have a sense of achievement that they won't be able to have if they haven't gone through this process. So it may be that this pain and suffering can be to some extent justified in that kind of way. So there's a whole range of theodicies. I've just given you a couple.
Hmm.
But I think even many theists find them less than entirely adequate. They feel that no, these are just not up to the job. And there is this alternative strategy which you can adopt, which is rather than try and give the explanations, identify them yourself, you can instead say, well, okay, maybe I can't think of an adequate explanation for this evil, but just because I can't think of it doesn't mean that it's not there. That would be a faulty inference. Now, an illustration that skeptical theists often use at this point. So skeptical theists are those who say they're theists, okay? So they believe in God. What they're skeptical about is not God. What they're skeptical about is our ability to know the reasons that God might have for these particular evils. And so an analogy they'll often use is to say, if you look into a garage from outside, you know, the door is open and you can't see any elephants in there, it's reasonable to conclude there is no elephant in the garage. You can move quite reasonably from I can't see it to it's probably not there. But that doesn't work for insects. Just because I can't see any insects in the garage from this distance doesn't mean that there are no insects there. There could easily be insects there. You know, I have limited perceptual abilities. They may be there and I just can't detect them. Well, similarly then, there could be reasons for the evils that are beyond my ability to think of them. Just because I can't think of them doesn't mean that they're not there. So the skeptical theist says, so you're not entitled to that second premise of the evidential argument from evil, the premise that gratuitous evils exist. Evils exist, but how do you know that any of them are gratuitous? To know that, you would need to know that there wasn't an adequate God-justifying reason for them, and you're in no position to conclude that because it doesn't follow from the fact that you can't think of the reasons that those reasons are not there. So that's a different way of dealing with the problem of evil. Rather than try and explain the evils, you say, well, maybe I can't explain them. It doesn't matter. What matters is that there could easily be reasons back there beyond our ken that would justify God in allowing these evils. So that disarms the evidential problem of evil, according to the skeptical theist.
Now, do you think that's satisfactory?
Well, this view is popular in some sort of theistic circles amongst some Christian philosophers of religion, but then others don't find it very persuasive. They feel there's definitely something's gone wrong there. My view is something has gone wrong. One way in which I think you can show that is by pointing out that you've opened a sort of skeptical Pandora's box by playing this particular card, skeptical theism. You've played the card in order to get yourself out of trouble with the problem of evil. The problem is that the skepticism now starts spreading all over the place. So, for example, the same kind of argument can be run for how there could easily be good reasons for God to deceive us about various things, the existence of an external world, the past, maybe the entire universe is only 5 minutes old and God is just creating the illusion that it's much older than that, including implanting memories in me. The truth of Christianity. Maybe there's a really good reason for God to deceive us into thinking that Christ is his son and that by believing in him we can be saved. Maybe there's a good reason for that. For all we know, there are good reasons for it, right? Just because you can't think of a reason doesn't mean the reason isn't there. So there could easily be these reasons, these justifications for God to deceive us in this way. And of course, God has the power to deceive us in these ways. So under those circumstances, we can no longer trust our senses. We can no longer reasonably believe anything about the past. And we certainly can't reasonably believe that Christ died for our sins and that by believing him, we can have eternal life. All of that knowledge is lost too. So the skepticism has gone all over the table and undermined all sorts of things that we didn't want it to undermine. We've saved the Christian faith and theism from the problem of evil by playing this skeptical card, but oh dear, it's turned out to prove too much, and we've undermined theism and the Christian faith in another way. So either way, you lose. I mean, that's one very obvious worry that people have raised about skeptical theism.
Right. It's kind of like, I don't know, introducing bats into a town to control the mosquito population, but then the bats, you can't control them and they proliferate and take over the town. That's, I don't know, kind of the potential here. But that's a nice segue to talking about evil God, because you've just been describing potentially a deity that deceives us for his or her or its own purposes. Let's talk about evil God. So what is the evil God argument?
Before we got into the evil God, though, this
Sure.
scenario on which God is a deceiver doesn't require that God be evil
Sure.
at all.
Yeah. Yeah.
People will often say, but God is good, and so he would never deceive us, and so it's perfectly reasonable to trust our senses and so on. But there is a problem there. I mean, the Bible says that God is a deceiver. He's actually misled us. Jesus famously pulls a trick. I can't remember where. I'd have to go and look it up now. And certainly that, you know, there can be good reasons to the very best of
Right.
people will sometimes deceive if that's the right thing to do. And if that's true for us, that'll be true for God too.
Yeah.
And we don't know that there isn't a good reason for him to deceive us. So it seems that that's not really going to work. But I just wanted to make clear that this doesn't require that we think of God as being evil. It
Sure.
doesn't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
Anyway,
it does kind of, I mean, if like if you just kind of carry it down a little further, if God can have morally sufficient reasons known only to himself to allow us to have false beliefs, he could have sufficient reasons to allow us to have false beliefs about what is good and what is evil. And thus we may think of God, what we semantically say is good is in fact evil. So you kind of
yeah.
tumble into backwards into the argument, as it were. But yes, I
Yeah.
agree. I agree with your distinction. All right.
Mm.
So what is this evil God argument?
Right. Well, I was thinking about the problem of evil one day, and it occurred to me that, you know, we can flip many of the standard theodicies in defense of belief in an all-powerful, all-knowing, and supremely malevolent deity. So suppose that there is a God, but and he is all-powerful and he is all-knowing, but he's supremely malevolent. This is an evil God whose depravity knows no bounds and whose cruelty is beyond our comprehension. Suppose there's just that one God. Now, I think most people, if they consider that, will dismiss it instantly. That's a ridiculous hypothesis. Why on earth would anyone believe that? And if you then press them to explain why, in my experience, when I've actually done this, people say, well, but you know, look around you, there's there's too much good in the world. There's, you know, love, laughter, and ice cream, and rainbows, and puppies, and so on. An evil God wouldn't create a world like this. This would look like hell. You know, there wouldn't be a lovely view or whatever. An evil God wouldn't allow people to be nice to each other and reduce suffering. He would clamp down on that sort of behavior straight away. So you might think that on the face of it, there's ample evidence that there's no evil God. But of course, the argument that's being run there just is the evidential problem of good flipped, right? If you believe in a good God, you have to explain all of the evil that we see, seemingly gratuitous evil. If you believe in an evil God, you have to explain all of the apparently gratuitous good, the good that is unjustified from an evil God's perspective. And there certainly seems to be an awful lot of it. And so in thinking about this alternative God hypothesis, you can see that people will often immediately conclude, I think correctly, that there ain't no evil God because, you know, look out the window, too much good out there. Whereas when it comes to belief in a good God, it's, oh no, sorry, that argument doesn't work because I've got these various theodicies which I can run, and I've got skeptical theism and so on. And what I do with the evil God challenge is just illustrate how, well, first of all, skeptical theism works just as well in defense of belief in an evil God as it does belief in a good God, for example. Okay, so maybe there is a really good reason for an evil God to allow cheesecake or people to help each other or whatever it may happen to be. Just because we can't think of it doesn't mean that the reason isn't back there, right? It's the same logic, the same arguments apply. And so we can't conclude that any goods are gratuitous from the perspective of an evil God. Now, if skeptical theism works in defense of a belief in a good God, works just as well in defense of belief in an evil God. And yet most people think, no, I mean, that's, you know, there's some sleight of hand going on here. Surely we can know there's no evil God on the basis of observed goods. Similarly, you can flip many of the theodicies. So, for example, we've already looked at the free will kind of theodicy in defense of belief in a good God when you're dealing with what appears to be gratuitous evil. You can say that, well, okay, yeah, there's that pain and suffering caused by that person's actions, but that person has free will, and if we took the free will away, well, then we wouldn't have the ability to do for goodness of our own volition, which is what a good God will want. He will want us to not just be puppet beings, but that we freely choose to love him and do the right thing and so on. Without that freedom, moral goodness cannot exist. So he cuts our strings, sets us free. Some of us do bad stuff. That theodicy can be flipped in defense of belief in an evil God. So why does an evil God allow this person to help those who are suffering? Well, because he gave us free will. He could have made us puppet beings that always did the thing that maximizes suffering. But if we're puppet beings, we're not morally responsible for what we do. If we're not morally responsible, what we do won't be morally evil. Moral evil would not exist if we are not free. What an evil God is going to want is us freely choosing to do evil. But if we are given that choice, some of us will choose to do good, and that explains why some of us do, in fact, help each other. It's the price an evil God has to pay for allowing moral evil to exist in the universe. So you can see we've just taken a theodicy there and we've run it in defense of belief in an evil God. And it seems to work, you know, more or less as effectively. And that seems to be true for many of the theodicies. So, for example, you could run, some people run a character building theodicy, you know, the little girl on her bike. Yeah, there's pain and suffering, but it's allowing her to develop a sense of achievement and so on. Yeah, there is pain and suffering, but it gives us opportunities to grow and develop morally and spiritually, allegedly. Well, similarly then, yeah, God gives us healthy, fit young bodies for a short period of time, but just for a short period of time. Then he begins to take it away. That's so much more cruel than if he'd never given you the good thing in the first place. So you will either die, probably horribly, or you'll grow old and decrepit, and the good things will be taken away from you slowly and in an excruciating way until you die having lived out a short and ultimately meaningless existence. That's so much more cruel than never having given you the good stuff in the first place. You know, why does he give some people great health, wealth, and happiness to maximize the suffering of everyone else? You know, who can rest content when they have so much and we have so little, that they don't deserve it, that we know now, no matter how hard we work, we will never achieve it, and so on. It's just a recipe for endless psychological torment and so on. So it turns out that most of the goods can, you know, you can cook up explanations, often very similar explanations, or even the same explanation that your typical theist or Christian will cook up in defense of belief in a good God. You can do the same stuff with more or less the same effect, it seems, in defense of belief in an evil God. And then the question is then, why is one of these gods so much more reasonable than the other? If belief in an evil God is downright ridiculous, and we can know that on the basis of just looking out the window, why can't we know that when it comes to belief in a good God? That's a mystery at this point. So the challenge is to try and explain for the person who believes that, no, these gods are very different on the scale of reasonableness. One is, you know, at least halfway up the scale of reasonableness. It's not unreasonable to believe in a good God, whereas belief in an evil God is like believing in Santa Claus or gremlins or something like that. If that's the position you take, well, you've got a bit of explaining to do, because the theodicies and the skeptical theism, well, we're all square there. There's no real advantage to one of these God hypotheses compared to the other yet. So we need to look at other things.
So is it fair to say that the argument is relatively has a narrow scope in the following sense, that it's targeting a particular way of reasoning to the justification of theism, such as in classic theology, theologians would talk about 4 ways to know about the nature of God. And one of those was the way of causality, which is that you reason about the cause by studying the effect. So just as you see a massive crater, you can reason about the cause of what brought about that crater by studying the crater. So interesting actual kind of pun there, from crater to creator. So you can learn about the creator by studying the world as the creator's effect. And so what you're saying is the theist has reasoned, well, there is this ratio of goods to evils in the world that justifies concluding that the creator has this perfect moral nature. And you're saying, well, you could actually flip that on its head. and so have also the ratio of good to evil justifying an evil God. And so what I'm saying then is it possible that a person could concede that your argument is sufficient to undercut justification for theism based upon reasoning to the cause from the effect, but there could be other reasons to be a theist, such as proper basicality, right? You're very familiar with the reform
Yeah.
epistemology take. So if a person were to say, well, I think that one just forms belief in God as a properly basic belief, and I can concede the alternative scenario is possible here, but it's really no different than the evil demon who deceives me, but that doesn't undermine my basic commitment to the trustworthiness of my sense perceptual faculties. So my basic commitment to theism is not critically undercut by the possibility of your scenario because I didn't engage in the kind of reasoning you're targeting to begin with.
Yeah. Some of that's right and some of it is wrong, I think. So I think to start, you started off with a classic actually misunderstanding of the evil God challenge. So the challenge is not a challenge to those who will infer things about the nature of God based on goods and evils that we observe. Look, it's a much better world. It's got a lot more good in it than evil, so that points towards a good God. Or it's not challenging that kind of reasoning at all. It's not a parody of that kind of reasoning at all. It doesn't even matter what the ratio of good to evil is. There could be more good than evil, more evil than good. It's irrelevant. What matters is that there's sufficient quantities of both. Whether or not there's a lot more of one than the other is beside the point. As long as there's enough of each, gratuitous goods, gratuitous evils, or seemingly gratuitous goods and evils, then we can cross out those God hypotheses. Not that the suggestion is not that somehow the ratio or something somehow supports belief in one of these gods. No, the suggestion is that there's enough of the evil. Clearly there's gratuitous evil, and if there's gratuitous evil, then there's no good God. Similarly, if there's gratuitous good, then there's no evil God. So we're not inferring that there's a good God on the basis of observed goods and evils. No, quite the opposite. We're crossing out gods, not making a case for them. So to suppose that that's what I'm kind of parodying, a sort of certain kind of argument for God, is a misunderstanding. What I'm suggesting is that observed goods and evils provide a more than adequate basis for crossing these two gods off your list of likely candidates. That's the reasoning. Now, but what you're right about is that there could be other reasons for believing in one or other of these two deities, which are very, very powerful, which would then tip the balance back in the direction of belief, or at least make it not unreasonable to believe in one or other of these two deities. So maybe you've got a fantastic argument for the existence of an all-powerful, all-knowing and all-good God. It's an armchair argument. A priori, it's not based on observation of the world around us at all. If you've got that, well, and if it's a knockdown proof, then you can be pretty sure that those evils ain't gratuitous. Then there's going to be a good reason for them, even if you can't think of it, because you've got this fantastic, compelling argument that there must be such a being. So you could do something like that. That would work. Or or maybe something like your proper basicality, something like that. I haven't discussed that at all. I'm not attempting to undercut that kind of reasonableness with this argument. Really, what the argument, I suppose, well, I mean, I guess I'm probably trying to do more than one thing with the evil God challenge. I think the first thing I'm trying to do with it is to use it as a spell breaker. There's a tendency when people hold the belief and it's threatened to try and start explaining away the evidence. When we have a lot invested in a belief, this is the first thing we tend to do. And so this is particularly true of political beliefs. If you have strong political views, if somebody comes up with an argument or evidence that suggests that actually what you believe isn't true, your first thought is, well, I'm going to try and pick holes. I'm trying to explain why that isn't really strong evidence against what I believe. Or if you've got a life project, you know, you've always worked for the tobacco company and you've been proud of the work that you've done, and then somebody presents you with evidence that actually tobacco causes cancer, you're going to try and find a way to pick holes there and explain away the evidence and so on. People that you love, you know, I love my wife. If the police come and give me what looks to be pretty good evidence that she's a serial killer, they've got an uphill battle there. I'm really going to start explaining away the evidence. So this is what we tend to do. We tend to get defensive, we entrench, we start explaining away the evidence. And the other thing we do while we're doing that very often is we start pointing at mysteries. Well, can you explain this? Can you explain that? That tends to happen at the same time. So I'm trying to think of a good example, and I'm struggling now. But yeah, a good example would be young Earth creationism. So there's a wealth of evidence that the universe is much older than 6,000 years, and yet some Bible literalists believe that actually the world is that old, because that's what it says in the Bible. And when you present them with evidence against what they believe, like light from distant stars, the fossil record, Arctic ice cores, the White Cliffs of Dover, whatever it might happen to be, tectonic plate movements. There's just a wealth of evidence that the universe is much older than 6,000 years. They are very, very, very good at explaining away that evidence. And if you go on something like Answers in Genesis, that website, you'll find they're really, I mean, these are clever people. Some of them even have PhDs. They are working really hard to explain away all of the evidence. And at the same time as they're explaining away the evidence, they're firing mysteries at you. Well, can you explain how life began? Can you explain this seeming anomaly in the fossil record? Can you explain the Cambrian explosion? Can you explain? They'll fire these mysteries at you whilst explaining away all of the evidence. And if you're not really, really knowledgeable and good at dealing with these kind of techniques, you'll be out of your depth, and the audience will think that this person really has a point. They really have a pretty strong argument. So if you put these two strategies together, explaining away and firing mysteries off at people, you can defend your belief system pretty much come what may, despite the fact that it's actually ludicrous. And it seems to me, this is contentious, obviously, but it seems to me that belief in an all-powerful, all-knowing, and supremely malevolent deity is patently absurd. But you can see how somebody could defend that in this way. Firing off mystery. Can you explain why the universe exists? No, but I can. My evil God created it in order to introduce suffering into the universe. No. Can you explain why there's life? No, you can't. I can. My evil God created it so that he can torture it, right? And then when you present evidence against what I believe, I explain it away using my flipped theodicies or skeptical theism. Is my position rational? No, it's insane. It's completely bonkers. And hopefully the theists can see that. The important thing for them to notice is that what they can see is downright irrational when it comes to the defender of belief in evil God is exactly what they're doing. It's the same strategy. They're doing the same thing. So it's a way of kind of breaking the spell. People convince themselves, young Earth creationists or whatever it may be, they're very good at convincing themselves that they're being rational and reasonable, and all those people out there are being unreasonable, and they can't see how rational and reasonable I'm being. If you come at them head on, like a young Earth creationist, with the evidence, they're ready for you. The right strategy, it seems to me, when it comes to young Earth creationists, is to try and creep round the back and get them to see that that thing over there is unreasonable. And then you point out the similarities and try and get them to see the difference, explain the difference between these two scenarios. And that is exactly what's going on with the evil God challenge. Everyone can see that that's nuts, belief in an evil God, right? And they can see why it's nuts. So now the challenge is to explain why belief in a good God is significantly more reasonable than that. It's a kind of a spell breaker, a way of getting people to, just for a moment, snap out of it
Yeah.
if they've got themselves really entrenched in their worldview and are just habitually just batting away the evidence using these familiar techniques. Yeah, I guess that's how I think of it. And by the way, I don't claim credit for inventing the evil God challenge, because once I had thought of it, I then fairly quickly discovered that other people have actually talked about this previously. I think the thing I can claim credit for is perhaps is probably for publicizing it a great deal and developing it a great deal. So that the Evil God Challenge paper is the most downloaded paper of religious studies of the last decade, it turns out. So
Wow.
yeah. So I guess, sorry, that was a bit long-winded, but that's kind of how I think about the Evil God Challenge. It's almost a psychological tool to break the spell, rather than anything else. Does that
Well,
make sense?
yeah, that kind of the thing I wanted to conclude with, and this is a nice segue into that, is to talk a little bit in your general sense of at this point, the intellectual credibility of theism and Christianity. But so just to offer a few comments on that. So you talked about this methodology or the strategy of giving all these different arguments from that people like young earth creationists use. The term for that is the Gish Gallop. So Dwayne Gish was a well-known young earth creationist, and when he would debate Darwinians, neo-Darwinians, he would always give all these things about mysteries and so on, and things that they couldn't reasonably address in the confines of a 1 hour debate, right? And so the point there is to just kind of raise this doubt in the audience and so on, and so that's the Gish Gallop. And it is frustrating, but I'll say I've debated atheists where they gave me a Gish Gallop as well about Bible difficulties or something else. So the strategy can work in various ways.
Of course, it's something that you can do with any belief.
Yeah,
Any belief can be defended. Yeah. What you need to look for is the mechanisms that are being applied, and also these mechanisms crop up in conspiracy theories.
Yes.
So the 9/11. Why? Can you explain why the towers came down exactly like that, and why there were these little puffs of smoke? And can you explain? They'll fire mysteries at you over and over again, and then when you come back at them with evidence that it wasn't an inside job. They start explaining it away or appealing to something like skeptical theism. Well, the dark forces, the CIA working behind the scenes, we don't know what reasons they might have had to do it that way. So the same kind of strategies are being employed. And whenever you see people sort of habitually reasoning and thinking in that kind of way, a little red light should come on. And the truth is that we all tend to do it, actually, when it comes to belief systems that we've committed to. We have a lot of emotional and personal investment in them.
Well,
I'm guilty. I'm sure I'm guilty of it too.
We're all works in progress, perhaps.
Yeah.
Okay, so you use terms bonkers, nuts, and spellbreaker. Those ones kind of stood out to me. And my question, I guess this will be the concluding question, which does tie into that thing I wanted to discuss finally, the intellectual credibility of theism or Christianity. When you talk about using this argument as a tool to break a spell, help people appreciate certain things are nuts or bonkers, it is the idea here that there is an objective understanding for any rational person who's perfectly rational or more rational than not or whatever, that they would be able to see that this is objectively bonkers, and that's the spell that's being broken? Or is it more modestly a tool to help people to see that different people have different plausibility frameworks of interpreting data, and having yourself confront the evil God argument as a way of shaking your plausibility framework, helping you to become aware of it, not necessarily to show that the theist plausibility framework is objectively bonkers or nuts, but at least to help them become aware of it and that other people don't hold it and assess data differently. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I'm just thinking, yeah. So,
if I can just tell you, so as you know,
yeah,
I mean, I reviewed Believing Bullshit 10 years ago. I gave it a somewhat critical review. I do really enjoy the book, but one of the challenges I had is that sometimes the thing that we call bullshit is relative to our plausibility framework,
Yeah.
and the other person's going to have a different assessment of what is bullshit. Or in this sense, where bullshit is, I guess, something like nonsensical, nuts, or bonkers.
Yeah. 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 So, I mean, plausibility structure is, I mean, one of the problems I've got here is that I'm aware that the people listening to this may have only a very slight understanding of what we may now get into, and I don't want to leave everyone behind. So, so I'm going to be careful with what I say. I mean, I think what I would do is I would point you to young Earth creationism, for example. I think you and I both know, don't we? We know that it's not true, and in fact, it's highly irrational. But they could say, "Oh no, but what about my plausibility structure? What about my background beliefs?" I mean, I'm just starting with, you know, this is the word of God, and that's how it strikes me. And you know, I have no reason to begin with to doubt that this is the word of God. And if this is the word of God, then and from there they then move on to defending their faith based on the book that they believe is authored by God, and that must be interpreted in as literal way as possible. That's where they're starting from. They're still nuts. And we know it, right? So there's a limit to what you can do. I mean, when I say nuts, I don't mean I don't mean that they are actually insane. What I mean is that particular belief and the structure and the kind of mechanisms that they're engaged in there to defend their belief are just so far removed from genuine rationality that you know, it's screwy thinking. Not that they themselves are mentally deficient. Often these are very intelligent people. So yeah, so we can see very often that these belief systems genuinely are ludicrous, despite the fact that the people embedded in these little bubbles of belief are utterly convinced that they're the ones that are being rational and we're the ones that are somehow being deluded or led astray by Satan or whatever it may happen to be. And that is how I think about mainstream Christianity. Which is an uncomfortable situation for me talking to you, because I know you believe in it, or some version of it. But that is my view, and I'm not going to sort of shy away from it. It does seem to me to look very, very similar to young Earth creationism in terms of sort of the overall architecture of it. But maybe I'm wrong, and yeah, maybe there is a good armchair proof of the existence of God, or good reason to think that well, you know, maybe it's reasonable to believe in God on the basis of some sort of subjective experience or personal experience, and that can be maintained even in the teeth of evidence to the contrary quite reasonably. I mean, there are philosophers that take that view, but I think there are problems with all of these responses. So yeah, so it's a difficult situation really to find yourself.
Yeah.
I mean, I genuinely think Christianity is a bit like young Earth creationism. It's exhibiting the same rational architecture, and that seems insulting and horrible, but it is what I believe, and I just got to be honest about it.
Well, if you're gonna roll your eyes at my beliefs, I'd rather you do it to my face than behind my
Yeah.
back. So I appreciate that.
Good.
Can I just give one
In the same way,
illustration?
could I just add, in the same way, you know,
Yeah.
if people genuinely think that, you know, as a result of my holding the beliefs that I do, that I'm going to burn in hell, well, you know, I absolutely, you know, fully understand why they're going to go out of their way to try and save me, and that, you know, nothing could be really more important than that, and that, you know, so, you know, I appreciate that too. I certainly don't want to stop people evangelizing and making a case for Christianity in whichever way they see fit. Go ahead.
I think we all, as you're saying, we all owe each other the courtesy of being honest in our different perceptions of one another. Uh, we did go a little longer than I had anticipated, but I've loved
Sure.
every minute of it. I just wanted to throw one thing back at you in light of what you just said and get your feedback.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
let's say that you have different people. Like I love cars, and I like to invest in keeping the cars I have on the road. But like I have one car that the frame is getting rusty, and there's going to come a point where it's no longer worthwhile to keep it on the road. And it's just a plain gray sedan, and there's not a lot of value in keeping it on the road. But if I perceived that that car was going to be a true classic, then I would, even though right now the Kelly Blue Book, value of the car may not be worth investing in repairing the frame, I might go ahead and make that investment. If you didn't think that car was eventually going to be a classic, you'd be like, I'm throwing good money after bad, and I'm just wasting my money. And it seems to me that somewhat, no analogy is perfect, but the point here is that we all invest in certain projects in terms of our belief systems, like a car. And I think one is true, analogous to a classic. So I'm going to put more intellectual effort, like fixing the frame, into defending and keeping it on the road. And you're like,
Yeah.
why are you keeping that gray sedan on the road? For you,
Mm.
that is not a classic, but you might have a different car that you invest in. And that would take us out of the kind of just view from nowhere. That's just obviously bonkers, to we all have different projects and invest in different things based upon our perception as to what is a classic or what is true. Does that make sense? Is that fair or not?
I'm not sure I fully understand the analogy. So it's the idea that, if you've got a belief system, you'll kind of keep fixing it up.
Yeah,
Keep it
you
going.
respond to defeaters,
Yeah.
and you also have again a properly basic perception of, well, this will be a classic. Another person, that's not going to be a classic. So similar to, this is I believe this is true. Another person, I don't
Yeah.
believe that's true. And so it's just going to lead to a different assessment as to what's worth investing in, and at what point are you throwing good money after bad.
Yeah. God, that's quite complicated. So, I mean, the thing about the car is, you just value it, and that's fine. You care about it, so you'll just keep spending the money. It's worth it to you. Similarly, if you value a belief system, you can just keep defending it come what may. Young Earth creationism or 9/11 was an inside job or whatever. But that doesn't give you any reason at all to think that the belief system is true. It's not true. All of the evidence strongly suggests it's not true, despite the fact that you might value it. So truth doesn't enter into the car story, whereas it does enter into the belief system story in that way. So there's a bit of a disanalogy. And then proper basicality, which is very interesting. And I'm very sympathetic to the idea that some beliefs might be properly basic. I mean, sure. But I've thought about that, and it seems to me that whilst it might seem to somebody that they have some kind of personal experience of God communicating to them, or revealing himself directly to them, or perhaps revealing directly to them that the Gospels are true, they just know that when they look at the text, the Holy Spirit works with them to allow them to just see the truth that's there on the page. It's actually, it might be reasonable for somebody to believe on that basis alone, but not once they know more about human beings and their susceptibility to false positive belief in extraordinary hidden agents more generally. It's just a weird fact about humans. We're just really prone to believing in dead ancestors or spirits or ghosts or hidden extraordinary beings, the CIA working behind the scenes in the Twin Towers, whatever. We're just highly prone to false. There's no culture on the face of the planet that you don't find these kind of beliefs. It's absolutely ubiquitous, and we know that we're highly prone to false beliefs of that kind. And beliefs in gods are of that nature. And so, personally, I think that gives you a defeater for your belief in gods or your dead auntie being in the room with you or whatever it might happen to be, once you have that further background knowledge. But this is a whole massive, big topic, and I've only just taken the lid off this can of worms, so we can't really get into it. But
Yeah.
that's my suspicion anyway. But of course, I'm not really making much of a case for it here.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's in a sense not fair for me to drop a segue to a whole nother discussion and debate at the very end of a conversation.
We'll do it next time.
Definitely.
Yeah, we can do it again. Yeah,
Yeah.
Proper basicality.
We'll
I'll
do
have to get back. I'll have to go and read my Plantinga again. It's been a while.
All right.
Yeah.
Well,
Okay.
Stephen, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. And I think you've just modeled the value of public philosophy for everybody today, and just for each one of us, that philosophy is not just an academic enterprise, it's a human enterprise. So thank you very much.
Oh, no, thank you. Thank you for your, you're doing the same thing. We're not on the same team when it comes to theism, but we're very much on the same team. Otherwise, we both value clear argument, cogent thinking, making this stuff accessible and spreading the word. And you're doing a fantastic job at that. So
dare I say amen?
Yeah, amen to that.
All right.